Hi, it's your favorite history teacher, Mr. Thomas, here to talk to you today about the last installment I have on the French Revolution, from the birth of the National Convention on to the end. So, without further ado, let's start. Let me go ahead and minimize myself and move on to the National Convention. This government is going to take the place of the old legislative assembly that was created under the Constitution. Now, that Constitution had only been into effect for about a year, but it's kind of hard to have a Constitution that calls for a limited monarchy with a king when that king was considered a traitor for trying to flee the country in the midst of a revolution. The National Convention will establish the first French Republic, and two political groups, the Girondins and the Jacobins, are going to be fighting for control of this particular assembly. It is important right now to mention Jean-Paul Marat. He is a Jacobin, and he's editing a real radical newspaper known as the Friend of the People. Now, he's often in a bathtub because he had contracted a skin disease and the baths were medicinal for him. But his newspaper is quick to accuse many people of being against the revolution and calls for their execution. And as people start to get executed because his newspaper is calling for it, Jean-Paul Marat increases in prestige and power. Now, this comes to a head by July of 1793 because a woman from the provinces, Charlotte Corday, goes ahead and is able to assassinate Jean-Paul Marat by getting into the same room that he's in with his medicinal bath. And she is able to pull out a small knife and goes ahead and stabs him. She's caught immediately and she is going to be executed, but Jean-Paul Marat is now going to be seen as a martyr, somebody who has died for his beliefs for the French Revolution. And Jacques-Louis David, this famous painter of the French Revolution, is going to have this painting get created. Look at the way his body is draped. It's done to remind you of Michelangelo's Pietà, sculpture that was done during the Renaissance. And Jean-Paul Marat is draped in a similar fashion that Christ was in that particular Michelangelo work of art. And what Jacques-Louis David is trying to do is draw the martyrdom of Jean-Paul Marat and the martyrdom of Jesus together. Georges Danton is another Jacobin who is quite powerful at this time. He's going to become the first leader of the Committee of Public Safety, which we're going to have more about later, but it's a group of about a dozen guys that rules France as a collective dictatorship under the National Convention. Now, Georges Danton is a supporter of the use of terror, because he believes that the revolution is hanging on by just a thread. There are outside forces, Austria and Prussia, that are using their militaries to try and put King Louis back onto the throne. Inside, you have the Girondins and the Jacobins that are fighting one another. And there's rumors that there are people around the Republic that don't necessarily trust the revolutionaries, and even some others that think the revolutionaries have gone too far with their actions against the church with that civil constitution of the clergy. Along with Georges Danton, there is Maximilien Robespierre, who is a tremendous speaker, and he is going to become the second leader of the Committee of Public Safety. Robespierre sees an opportunity to institute a great number of changes here, and he wants to use terrorism not just to simply scare people into supporting the revolution, but to try and create a new kind of society, one based in civic virtue. In other words, one that's really based on Enlightenment ideas. He wants to, for instance, create a new calendar and a new 10-day week where there are no more Sundays and the church is going to lose their influence because of it. He wants to abolish the old ways. So you could see one of his ideas to de-Christianize France by changing the calendar. No longer would you have different months that people were used to. There'd be 9 days of work between days of rest. You would have all of these different months of the year named after something that would be associated with them. So the old April would become the new Floria, or the old July would become the new Thermidor. His ideas was to change the calendar to try and abolish the old Christian ideas and replace them with new Enlightenment ones. In order to do a lot of these things, you had to abolish the monarchy. The royal family lived, and so the monarchy could be restored. They were arrested and tried for treason, and conviction was a foregone conclusion. Louis XVI was tried and convicted and guillotined on January the 21st, 1793. And this is a depiction right here of his head getting severed from the rest of his body. Several months later, in October, you had Marie Antoinette, who was facing an even more angry crowd. The king was at least French. Marie Antoinette was seen as an Austrian outsider who was the old Madame Deficit. The king's and queen's daughter, Maria Therese, was allowed to go to Austria in 1795 because France had never had a tradition of queens ruling. Queens were just the wives of kings. Their son, however, Louis Charles, who became Louis XVII upon his father's death, was beaten and abused and eventually dies in prison at a mere 10 years old. And here are some depictions of what had happened during that time. Now, obviously, if you look at these with the different kinds of demons that you see out here, this was not a picture that was done inside France. This was a commentary on those actions by other outsiders. This is a neat little historical artifact here where you have the actual blade, the guillotine blade, that was used to kill Marie Antoinette. September the 5th to July the 27th, 1794, France goes into the Reign of Terror. The Committee of Public Safety, headed by Danton and later by Robespierre, puts France under martial law with the law of suspects, which allowed for the arrest, trial, and conviction of anybody for not supporting the revolution. It becomes treasonous and punishable by death to merely speak against the revolution. Thousands, tens of thousands of people died from the national razor at this point in time. So, under this law of suspects, if you were seen as somebody who was complaining about bread prices, that might be enough to convict you. If you were somebody who was seen saying good thing about the king or the ways it was under the old regime, you could be arrested and killed under the law of suspects. If you said something negative about the National Convention or the Committee of Public Safety, you could be arrested and killed under the law of suspects. The Jacobins are going to use this law of suspects to attack their political enemies and solidify their power. But it comes around to bite them because once this terror is unleashed, it's near impossible to stop. Outsiders see France as a nation that is out of control. During the course of the Reign of Terror, the Girondins are the first that try and end it, and they get accused of treason and killed, which makes the Jacobins quite happy. Guys like Danton and Robespierre are more than happy to get rid of their biggest political opponents. But after the Girondins are gone, Georges Danton believes that the terror had achieved its goals. The French military start to have a few victories against the Austrians and the Prussians. The revolution is strong. Traitors have been eliminated. And Georges Danton says it's time to end the terror. Well, Robespierre, jealous of Danton's power and popularity, now uses the law of suspects to accuse Georges Danton himself of being against the Reign of Terror and against the revolution. And Maximilien Robespierre takes over as the new leader of Committee of Public Safety when Georges Danton and his followers get executed on Robespierre's order. Now, Robespierre continues this reign of terror and uses it to attack his enemies, except in early June 1794. Robespierre understood that the French people were strong Catholics and that this religion needed to get replaced with something. Civic virtue wasn't merely enough. He wanted to have a new religion based on civic virtue. And he celebrates the Festival of the Supreme Being on June the 8th, 1794. And here's an image of what that was like. They create this fake mountain inside the city of Paris, and at the height of the festival, Maximilien Robespierre himself comes out at the top of this mountain dressed in a toga and has choirs of school children singing to him, and he's taking the adulation of the crowd, and people are starting to wonder about him. Does he see himself as a god right now? What is this supreme being that's supposed to replace religion? The calendar's already been changed, but now the religion of the people themselves are starting to get changed, and people are worried that too much power has gone to his head. So in the month of Thermidor, which we would typically call July, you get the end of Robespierre. He makes a tactical mistake. He delivers a speech to the National Convention in which he says he has a list of traitors that has yet to be published. And as he delivers that speech to the National Convention, many people there are worried that they're on that list and that they're going to be killed. So they agree. The next day, when he goes to speak, they're going to shout him down and arrest him. They do. Robespierre and his cadre of followers get shouted down the next day. They get arrested. They're going to be locked into some offices. Robespierre actually tries to kill himself, and he ends up shooting himself in the mouth, which is why you see him in this picture right here, lying on a table with blood coming out of his chin. He is eventually going to be denounced. He's going to be taken to the guillotine, and he is going to be killed on July 28th, 1794. With this comes the end of the Reign of Terror. They needed to get rid of Robespierre in order to end this terror that had taken place in France. They also need to replace the government, the National Convention, with something else. And out of that comes the Directory, which happens in year 3 of the Republic. The Directory is a group of 5 men that are appointed by the legislature. They are supposed to rule France collectively, but each one of them is corrupt and they don't necessarily want to work with one another because each one thinks if they can just get rid of the other 4, they'll be in charge of France. Under the rule of the directors, France becomes a weaker, poorer, more frustrated country. During the time period of the convention, France undergoes a great many changes. They do adopt the metric system, getting rid of the old ways of measurements associated with the old regime and coming up with new scientific-based ones. They abolish primogeniture, policy that the eldest son was going to inherit the father's estate. They ended debt imprisonment. They ended slavery in France's colonies, but then reinstituted it a little bit later. They're also able to establish a nationwide system of public education. Nationalism is increased. People no longer thought of themselves as coming from Paris or Marseille or Grenoble. They thought of themselves as French. And this national pride gets fueled as they had more and more military successes against other nations. Napoleon Bonaparte rises during the French Revolution to become a great military leader, and he is eventually going to overthrow the Directory with a coup d'etat. With that, and Napoleon's rise, ends that 10-year period of the French Revolution. The old regime was one of absolutism up until 1789. Then the National Assembly comes in to write that Constitution, and they're around for 2 years before that Constitution is written, and you have a limited monarchy under the Legislative Assembly, which only lasts for about a year until the National Convention comes in, and they are going to control France, especially through that 12-man group of the Committee of Public Safety. Then the Directory comes, and Napoleon is going to overthrow that Directory in 1799, become First Consul, and then later he's going to become an emperor.